Hello and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Abuck Nasty. In this video, we're going over the finals of the 2025 Q1 competition for chemical science. I'm super excited about today's video. Today's video is, we're going to be benchmarking all the designs that made it to the finals, so congratulations to all the people that made it. But mainly, the thing that I'm really excited about is that we have a whole bunch of hybrid designs. By a whole bunch, okay, we have like 5. But 5 is still quite a lot, because what they basically did is we took a few of the different core concepts from some of the best performing designs, and we created kind of hybrids from those. So me and some of the people on my Discord server wound up going and creating different design hybrids. So super excited to talk about them. Before I get into the actual results and talking about designs, how did we go about hybrids? So we went first into an exploration into components. So one of the things that we went into was going into red circuits. So specifically what we wanted to do was saying, okay, let's go and copy, for example, design 1 from Undertow. And if you don't know what these designs are, go and look at the GitHub page that I have, or you can also refer to the last video where I covered already some of these different designs and some of their original performance metrics. So basically, I took from each of the designs that were within the top 9 a copy of basically the isolated red circuits. So some of them did direct insertion of red circuits, so those were not included, but if they had a dedicated production, basically going from an electromagnetic plant to a belt, then those were chosen to be a candidate. So we have a few in this comparison, so I wanted to do an isolated benchmark of just these components. So there's one here from Undertow, Flap, Lady Mayneth, myself, from Geist, and then there were 2 other ones that were added, basically just because they wanted to basically look at, so Henry JK and Theon wanted to say, hey, look, these were dedicatedly built specifically just for red circuit production. It wasn't incorporated into the full assembly, but I'd like to test them out anyway. So I was like, cool, let's go and test those out. So we didn't do, what I will say, is we didn't do engines. The reason I didn't do engines, because engines are kind of, it's hard because of how close the ratio is. Basically the engine modules and then the chemical science building, because they're so close. There's a lot of direct insertion builds, so how do you really compare those? I don't know. So for that, I kind of left that out and then incorporated that into a few of the hybrids, and then we can, so in other words, I won't be able to give a perfect answer today on if engine to chemical science is better, but we will talk a lot about clocking methods in this video, because that's one of the biggest differentiators between all these designs. So on that note, because we're talking about clocking and all those things, let's first talk about the results from these red circuit builds here, and then I'll go into a high level on some of the differences between them, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we're here now with the results of all those designs, those first 7. So each save was recorded for 18,000 ticks, and for 10 runs, there was 100 copies of 320 per second of red chips. Now, just to put that in perspective, there are 92 copies in all the original benchmarks that we ran for the last part of the competition. They're making 240 signs per second. Those 92 copies only require 180 per second. So this is over double the amount of red signs production just to create some kind of a load on the system. So when we're looking at this, just keep that in perspective, that at the economy of scale, that the percentages that exist between that you're going to see here, the relative performance improvement that you're going to see here is not going to directly translate to the performance improvements you'd see in chemical science, because the assumption would be that red circuits would have to take up the majority of CPU time, when that's not always going to be necessarily the case. So just keep that in mind for micro benchmarks like this. That being said, what's interesting here is if we look at the overall average per tick metrics, there you can see kind of a similarity between Lady Mayneth and Flaps. Again, we're talking about basically a 0.74% difference between those 2 designs. But then going to my design and then over to Geist, you wind up seeing kind of slightly marginal improvements. So you see basically a 3% in decrease from Lady Mayneth to my design, and then overall a 1% decrease from Geist's. And then what's interesting is the 2 other submissions by Theon and Henry JK that came in that were outside of the scope of the other designs that I pulled from the competition itself. Those wound up being where we saw the largest jumps. So effectively there was a 2% increase from Henry JK's design and then a 5%, so the largest differentiator from Thales. So when we saw this and we were talking about it in Discord, we said, okay, this seems like, why is there so much larger of a change here? Like all the other percent differences are nowhere close to each other, right? So comparing them here, if we look at the actual designs, what's interesting about this is that, okay, these two designs performed very similarly. And if you look at like counts here and flap, I'm gonna have to modify this so that I can just literally talk about it. Let me grab my quality upgrade planner. And I don't even think I have something for belts, so let me just go and add those because you know, we need that. Alright, with that out of the way, what I wanted to count was here, there's like 56 inserters, right? Back inserters. And there are, over here, basically 48. So like the counts of buildings, although relatively similar, there's like, that didn't seem to make as much of a difference. And that's either even further exemplified by these two designs. When you look at, like, for example, the design that I have compared to Geist had a slightly better performance. There's 64 inserters here, and then you look at this and there's 42 inserters. And then you would think, like, okay, it's the number of inserters. Well, that completely turned on its head over here, because over here there are 60 inserters, and then there's 58 inserters, so almost about the same. So an increase in inserters was actually a performance difference here. So it leads you to kind of the question of why. Why is that happening? Well, if you start to look at kind of the behavior characteristics of these two designs here, is that there's, if you look at wake lists here, these are very tightly controlled. All these designs down here are pretty much tightly controlled. For very fast moving recipes that are just constantly active, that have like double swings and things like that, the wake lists are just being used here and these are fine. But what's more interesting to me is if you look at specifically the control tactic that was being used by Theon. Because this is what got us all excited. Because when we looked at the original implementation here, right, you see that there is a 5% decrease that comes from Theon's design compared to Henry JK's. And so you would wonder, like, okay, well, what was this quick kind of improvement here, and where did that really come from? That improvement stems from the clocking method that is being used. So the interesting part that comes about is this is using a clock, and it's basically on a 88 tick cycle. And so the way that this is doing this, at a high level, I'll try to explain it. I don't fully understand the full concept right now, so once I do, I'll create an actual tutorial video on it. But for right now, the high level of the way that I understand that the way that it works is it looks at what is the output production rate that I want in terms of the machine, so 45 items per second, and then it bases a clock looking at the input ingredients and says, okay, what is the full cycle range of all the inserters when they have to double swing or whatever it is. It's even described here, right? So the goal of this clock is to make it so that the inserters inserting into the red circuit build here is going to basically have 3 swings of plastic and green chips, and then 6 swings of cables for every single time. So basically a 2 to 3 ratio of how many swings they're going to put in. So the reason that this works out is mainly just due to the ratios of the input ingredients, right? And so what this build does really well is it's taking an approach here where it basically has a tick of, in the beginning of the cycle, it's going to insert green and plastic. And then towards also the beginning of the cycle, very simply, it's going to insert copper cables. And then that one wire is being sent across the network to each of the individual ones. So they're still broken out as separate networks. Why this works really well is it actually, in a way, is acting like a latch. It's only going to, during the crafting cycle of red circuits, it'll basically say, hey, in the very first part of it, I want to go and insert all the ingredients that I have. And then for the next half, so from the basically tick numbers 42 to 88, it's going to go and say, hey, I'm going to just now just let the machine constantly craft. And you can even see it's kind of underclocked for that reason. It'll run out of input ingredients occasionally, which is fine because we know this is producing over that, so 45.8 per second when we only need 45. So that's the first concept that's here. But why this manifests itself is it actually reduces the amount of control signals that are being sent over the wire here, because it keeps these active for a longer period of time. So instead of a quick pulse, whenever it drops below the automated insertion limit, it's just filling it up with 3 swings of plastics to put in basically 1632 and then 48 items total that are going to get put inside here. And so the same thing for green circuits. You're going to see this go up to 48 and then overshoot, and then basically it's going to constantly do that. And then copper is going to be constantly being used at a faster consumption rate, so it gets 6 times basically that it is inserted into there. So what that means is that this inserter is active the amount of the entire time and isn't having to make a check for if it has to put anything inside the machine because it can constantly run. So it just basically has a full active cycle that's running all the time. This seems to be a really interesting strategy on being able to improve the performance in general, and so this got us all really excited. So what we did is we said, okay, let's take this design and let's iterate on it and create a couple new versions for a second round of benchmarks to iterate off of this concept. So I'll show that in a second. I just want to touch on again, you can see that this seems like it's really coming down to inserter controls, because there's more checks that are being done, more overhead that is being done here to basically control them. These have more signals that are being sent and more combinators in order to control all the inserters, because they're swinging basically every single time that the machine drops under the limit. That's the traditional lead follower, or actually even more so, just traditional clocks are just, hey, on an interval, I'm just going to put one time an item in. Where this differentiates itself is it's now doing it based on the cycle time of the output that you want to be crafting at. So now it's, let's have a insertion phase and then a crafting phase, and let's have those as distinct concepts, which is something that you can now do because of how fast these inserters move. That wasn't the case when we didn't have legendary components. So that is a clear distinction that exists here. Okay, so now that we've covered that, let's go into the second phase. So you can see here 4 different designs that got created. So what Geist did, which I really liked, is he said, okay, I'm going to go and take the core concepts that we have, but what I don't like right now, and what he pointed out, and as we were talking about it, is this basically extra chest that we need in order to make this distance work. This design is nice because what it allows you to do is it allows you to easily tile it, right? So that was like one of the main benefits of this, was the easy tileability of the design. But what we said was like, okay, well, let's explore what happens if we use an extra cargo chest. So Geist created a design for this. Now, his clocking method is using traditional lead follower, and that's how this worked out. Now, he had some issues with getting the stack inserters with legendary to work, so he downgraded them to rare just to match more the output production. This has an effect here by having a larger swing time. The majority of the cost, though, for inserters isn't really coming from the swing itself. It's the unloading and scanning of belts. So this constantly running, this, I don't believe that the rare has such a larger impact to this, but I still wound up wanting to test it out. So this was the layout without using the other clocking methods. And then let's go and look at real quick, take a peek over at the results just so that you guys can see the comparison here. So for round 2, the way that this worked out is you can see that, okay, so Geist's design wound up being a good amount worse, actually about 11% worse than Thalen's design. So then if you look at that, you go like, okay, well, why is that? So it's either the rare inserters or it's the clocking method. So to kind of rule that out, I created an iteration from Thalen's design and Geist's design and created a hodgepodge or merger of all 3 of us in this design, which wound up performing ever so slightly better. So we're talking about a performance delta of minus 1.27% from Thalen's design to my design. So what is that design? That design is over here. So here you see the original one that Thalen created. And then here's the version that takes the layout from Geist that's really good, and then implemented the clocking strategy specifically that Thalen had created. So it's exactly the same clock that is going here. The changes that I made over Geist's design is I switched these back to legendary for that slight better improvement in performance of dropping. And then in order to make that work, I had to kind of change the spacing of the inserters where they're dropping onto the belt. But the benefit here that kind of comes from the clocks as well that I want to talk about is that because we're intentionally slowing down the machine itself, you won't have the traditional problems you have with the follower controls where you're going to have the machine is now the base of the clock. So the speed of the machine is the thing that you're controlling around. So lead follower is the speed is always set dynamically by the machine that you're following. And with the clock, well, no, you're just setting what the output rate that you want it to be and allowing it to underclock and stop occasionally like that. So that's where the clock benefited and allowed this to actually work. I just had to change the spacing to still get them to always unload at the same time. So once I got that to work, I changed a little bit of the spacing just to make overall the electric network slightly cleaner, but that's not really the point. The point was just using the clocking strategy and having the same beacon and entities and ratio and everything. If you look at that difference, coming back, what's interesting is just the sheer drop-off in entity update time. So control network time wound up being less as well because we're sending less signals over the network, which made sense because this was the traditional lead follower and this is using the other clocking strategy. And you can see that clocking strategy is exactly the same now to another version that Civcal created. We'll touch on that in a second. The thing that I wanted to kind of point out that I thought was really interesting is when you look at the comparison of going from Dalen's design that was using an extra chest, going over to the one that's a combination of the same exact clocking strategy, but now just using cargo wagons. As you can see that the cargo wagon time increased, and that also makes sense because entities themselves don't, basically a train is not counted as an entity, it's counted as its own category. So for that reason, when you look at the update time here, the trains went from 12 to 22, so a direct increase of 10 microseconds. And then if you look at the overall entity update time, it wound up going from 533 up to down to 515. So basically, if you take the difference here, accounting for noise, that's basically a 12 difference in entity update time and basically a 10 an increase in train time. And then I'm guessing the 2 other microseconds is probably just from the 2 other or 4 extra inserters that we removed because of that. So you can see kind of like there's diminishing returns that come from it, but so we tend to focus sometimes a lot on like, okay, how many inserters do we have? When it's more like, okay, what are you doing with those? And that actually is really nicely shown in the comparison from Thalen, Geist, and my design with Civcal's design. So in Civcal's design, one of the things that is exactly the same is the layout. So it's exactly the same layout as came from our design here. Now, one thing that got changed is there was an extra 2 inserters that are added. And so remember when we were talking about before that there is a ratio, right? Of basically there's gonna be 3 swings that we're gonna have of plastic and green chips and 6 swings of cables. So for that reason, what basically Civcal did here is he said, okay, I'm gonna take these 2 and I'm gonna double it up. Now, why is that being done? The reason is the clocking strategy is now using lead follower, but what it's doing is it's not setting it based on just when it's under a limit, it sets a latching condition, which can be seen here. So for those that are not familiar with the latch, what it is a red wire or a wire that loops back on itself and sends a value. And then you basically say, take this condition, or when this condition happens and the check mark happens to be active. What this basically does is the same thing as that original clock, but what it's doing now is it's based on the machine speed of the electromagnetic plant. So you can see here that it has a little bit more time that it takes basically here dropping to this belt where you can see these little wake lists that flicker on and off occasionally when it gets output blocked. Now, that's fine because we're overproducing. So again, like I said, clocks are going to be based on a fixed time rate. Lead followers based on the machine speed. So occasionally you'll have these start-stops where the machine itself can rest and the inserter can rest because the transport line is blocked. And so that's where it's like really critical with lead follower, why we do a lot of this side loading, is because the inserter can actually fully sleep as long as the transport line that it itself can see, right, is not moving anymore. And that means the inserter can finally rest. Now it still has the overhead of the circuit sending a signal, but there's pros and cons to that. The simplicity though that comes from this is that now you're just basically saying, hey, basically go and insert something into here whenever it's less than 4, or, and then basically once it goes less than 4, keep on inserting until we are greater than 42. That's basically how this logic works. Same thing over here. Now it's just taking ratios, right? So 42 and 42 and 84, because we need 2 times the amount for copper. So you can kind of just choose that, and you can just monitor the machine and do that, and instead of having to calculate the tick rate and those things. So in some ways simpler, and in some ways more complex, but so this is kind of interesting because what we've basically gained from this particular exploration is that we have a double swing or triple swing or whatever 6 interval correct version of name would be, but you have those number of swings that are coming about from basically the different clocking methods here. So multiple swings is good, as it seems like what it is. We have a clocked version of that, and we also have a new lead follower version that is a latched lead follower. So we have LF for latched or lead follow, and then latched lead follow would be LLF, right? So we have multiple ways that we can do this. So we have now new clocking strategies. And what I find really interesting about this is that you can see that there's actually double the inserters. And what you're seeing that is interesting for me as well is when you look at the performance differences, at least in the benchmark on my particular machine, the delta between these two was a 0.24%. So it seems like it's more about the active time of the entities and them doing something that matters more and how you're exactly controlling your inserters matters more than building counts or those kinds of things. So it comes, at least for this particular thing, you can really gain a lot more of an improvement by just changing your clocking strategy and eliminating the decisions the inserters are making. Because at a high level, just to retouch on this, inserters, the most expensive operation they have is picking up items from a belt. So this particular operation here, grabbing an item from a belt, is the most expensive. The second most expensive is dropping to a belt because it has to scan. The reason that this is the most expensive is because it has to scan the belt directly in front of it. If the belt is moving, it's way worse because now it has to scan multiple belts, right? And then the second thing that exists is the scanning of the contents in a building. That's a lot cheaper, and then ultimately scanning the target of where it needs to go. That's also cheap. And then the cheapest operation of all time is just the swinging itself. So that's kind of the order of things. So just to give kind of perspective on why like maybe double swinging and control decisions are better. So that concludes effectively what we decided for red circuits, and this was really useful because we incorporated that into some of the hybrid builds that were designed. And so I'll showcase now the hybrids build here next. So here are the hybrids. The hybrids are a collection of different concepts from other builds, and I wound up having some help from Thaon, so just want to say thank you very much for all the help. There's a few different designs we went back and forth on to kind of create these final ones, and so just appreciated the help in the clocking methods, as I'm still new and trying to understand it, and actually trying to reverse engineer it originally when I first saw the way that he was doing it. And then I got close to the concept, and that's actually what this first design is here, is using those clocks that are there, and it's a little bit more complex, but it wound up using the clocks to create these double swings. So you can see there's always a double swing that is coming from here, and then outputting, and there's the main thing was always dumping double from the output. Now the nice thing about this is this actually helps solve one of the output insertion limit issues. So the way that it kind of works is it's always going to be left with, when on a particular stack cycle, it's going to be left every once in a while with an extra 4, an extra 8, etc. on what it is actually picking up. And that's best exemplified by the example that Thaon sent me in his fully beaconed setup here. You can see, so this one's actually like the perfect clocking ratio, the way that he had created this, where it has 12 items that's picking up, and then it's 4. It's basically picking up the oscillation of the 12, the 4, the 8 that we talked about in the last videos. And what it does is it just keeps the inserter active just long enough to pick up 12, but not fully be able to pick up all 16 items. And so you can see that here, where basically the output here is going to be 12 at that instant. It can pick them all up, and then it stops. Now, it's doing the same thing before I fully understood the concept, where it just calculates, okay, well, you know, I need 120 exactly for this entire side. So that's going to be basically the base of the clock. And then it winds up then picking, either by observation or by actually computing it. You can look at basically the time of exactly when these would double swing to put items into the actual assembly machine here. So always kind of like double swinging like this. So it gets you around a problem with lead follower because it will have effectively like an insertion stage, a crafting stage, and a grabbing stage where it's grabbing them. So it's always kind of following in that pattern. I'll eventually go and create a more deep dive into this, but since I can't easily explain it quite yet, I'd like to get some more facts before I go and create a dedicated video on it so that I can explain it and keep it as simple as possible. But at a high level, the way that it works is it always is double swinging on the output, and it will, to prevent oscillations, it'll be either grabbing 12 or 4 occasionally at the end of the cycle. So it just basically extends the activation period long enough to grab that extra amount that would normally get output blocked and dumps them out. So what I like about this is I'll talk through some of these designs and where I got inspiration. So this particular design was inspired by the design that had the lowest entity update time out of all the designs in the previous round. And that's actually the design that was by Undertow. You can see here that the layout, effectively, of this here is very, very similar to the layout that I have. The only difference is that I wound up implementing the control strategy that Thalem had suggested, or had kind of created, to always have double swings. Now, the actual engine units don't double swing. They just perfectly just wait until they get output blocked at 16 every single time. So, and that's fine because it's exactly the amount that they need. So the ratios work out, so that's fine. They basically picked that up. That was kind of my thought process with it. And then I wound up actually clocking it. This was a little bit more difficult because of the timing of engine units and the difference in ticks that happen from pulling off a belt. This takes, you know, basically 8 ticks to pull it off with the first one, and then the second one as well. So like in general, in total, the safest one is like a total of, it is like 24 ticks basically that I keep these active for. But in theory, you could do 16 to grab them, but in practice, I wound up seeing the 24 ticks wound up working out. Because also on the labs that I designed, 24 ticks was the same basically output that I used, and that accounted for if the belt sometimes moves or doesn't move. So allows you to have that little bit of extra buffer there. So that's what I wound up choosing, and then the same thing here where it basically grabs the items and then outputs them for a little bit, and then will occasionally pick up an extra during that cycle. So I'm oscillating on 4, his design was oscillating on 12, so kind of similar in terms of concepts. But I wanted to try, okay, let me take this concept up here from that Undertow wound up creating. I believe I'm saying that right, yes. So, and because I just like the direct insertion layout that was here. I changed a little bit the ratios of around the beacons. So this is an 11 and 7 here. This is a 6 and 11. But again, kind of from some of the correlations that we saw in the last video, that didn't matter as much because this is so high in overproduction. It was mainly like, let's see what we can do with the inserters and clocking them. You can see here basically that this is fully being controlled by the circuit network. Now, one of the things that I then implemented as well, because I thought it would be interesting to do, I took the concept that came from CivCal, and I was saying, okay, well, let me use that, basically that exact same circuit, but just having a dedicated one because I happen to be picking up from a belt instead of directly inserting from an electromagnetic plant. Let me see if that makes an improvement as well to my particular red circuit design that I had. So I kept it very similar to my original red circuit layout, just because of the compactness of it, but then, and also my familiarity with how it works, frankly. But then I said, okay, let me take that concept and then let me introduce the latching everywhere. So I did that here. Instead of the improvement that I made was, instead of reading directly from the input of the actual cryogenic plant, wound up going saying, okay, I'm gonna basically just latch this in that same way. So this is all latching, and this actually worked out. It was a lot. Took me probably in reality to get this to work. Took me about 5 minutes total to finish this design. The clocking method over here probably took me about 2 hours to finally design. The clocks are more complex, but they could be worth it, right? So yeah, so just again, something to take into comparison. At the time, this concept didn't exist yet of latching, because Civcal hadn't thought of it. So I implemented with clocks. So I actually don't know if you could do it with a latching mechanism for this, but anyway, that's how I came to this point, just so that people know with that. So this is a combination of basically like 3 different designs, all kind of combined here for this. So this was an iteration that I created where I wanted to have just one electromagnetic plant. This was unfortunately not stable whatsoever, so this one got eliminated. For some reason, it'll just randomly just not produce exactly 240 per second, and I saw that at like the 70,000 tick mark and the benchmarks, so oh well, it happens. So that one's gone. But then what this next design that's here is a design that was the first hybrid, number 03, which is basically from Theon, which is effectively exactly the same design as my original design 14, which was wildly more complicated. This has 1 stage, which is a very nice improvement, because I'll just explain. You can just plop this down and it just works. Mine was, just walk you through it again. You run this, you wait for all the symbols here. You wait until until these chests are full, because that's what basically it's telling you to do. Then you go to stage 1, go to stage 2, and then you gotta wait until there's back pressure on the engines, and then it tells you the engines are back pressured. Cool. And yeah, so it's a lot more to do. And then it has this whole complicated priming sequence with all these things in, right? Okay. And then finally I can place the last stage down. Oof. All right, that took me longer to explain than just you plop this down, right? Yeah, and then technically you had to go delete these circuits, and yeah, anyway. So one of basically the benefits that I saw immediately is that because this is clocked to exactly 240 per second, then you really almost never have a situation where this final inserter here is output blocked. And that is a real thing. Like the cost of this, like the biggest cost of inserters is not the swing, it is the scanning, picking up something. This is basically the order of things. What's the most expensive? Scanning a belt to pick it up is the most expensive. The second most expensive is dropping it to a belt. The third most expensive is scanning a direct insertion machine by a lot smaller of a margin. Like it's a lot less order of magnitude. And the lowest is it swinging itself. So the longer an inserter spend dropping, because it's output blocked, the longer that scanning operation is happening, right? And that's also why it's fast. It should always be better to pick up from a non-moving belt, because this doesn't have to scan the whole length of the transport line because it's not moving itself. So if this whole belt, as you can see here, is not moving, then it just has to scan what's directly in front of it on pickup. So that also winds up being slightly better for the inserters themselves, so when it can fully stop like this. Otherwise, and this is just my hunch, if the belt is moving, in order for it to figure out which item it can pick up, it has to scan a couple more belts in front of it in order to know. So that's probably why it costs a little bit more, because it's scanning a few more belts. Again, I haven't proven this, but that is my intuition. It kind of works out too from just practice and testing from other benchmarks we've done. So this was a nice just overall improvement. Now, the downside to this particular design is when it picks up items from the actual, basically from the assembly machine here. You can see that it winds up having activations that are a lot more often. And why that is because it's always picking up on 8. Theon was telling me that he had a hard time getting the clocking to work with picking up 16 items, and that was a difference that exists in my design. Is the original version of it, at least, that you're seeing up here, is that it was using set filters and it would always be outputting exactly 16 items. So that was wind up being one of the things. And the reason why he said that this was an issue was because it would occasionally, by using set filters and things, it would kind of drop an uneven amount to the belt itself. So instead of sometimes it was grab 2 items instead of 6, all, stacks of 4. But the main reason that's why I have so many different stages is to exactly control when it starts and stops. So that's how I got 16 to work, and set filters made that easy. And then just using lead follower on this one here. So that is a difference. So the downside, although this is most likely the improvement here, the downside is probably going to come into the fact that this is doubling the amount of times of the activation signals and doubling the amount of times it's going to be scanning from this assembly machine. So we'll see if this winds up being worse or better, just in these two things in composite. So that's what I liked about kind of this Design 03 compared to my original design, is that we can talk about those things now in context and look at that. So that's kind of where we got for this hybrid. The Design 4 was a layout change that Theon kind of came up with. So it still has that limitation that I talked about with picking up items when they are greater than or equal to 8. So it has that double activation. But this is a lot more compact. And I like this because it reduces the number of beacons that are here overall. It also just shrinks the size of the build substantially. But it winds up then just basically using the exact same clocking strategy, because all these wind up having the same number of beacons and across the board here. So that seemed to be a nice overall change here. So cool design in terms of this. That's the main difference, is the layout change, not any of the other clocking. So the red circuits is exactly the same as my original build. So like for these, like Design 3, Design 4 by Theon, we're gonna go and compare those against the original version that I created, and we'll see what the differences are. So next, this is one that Theon and I directly collaborated on. We wound up taking his original red circuit build, and we wound up saying, okay, let's go and feed that into the recipe switching build that I have. But let's have 2 copies of it. And he wound up having one centralized clock for all of the assembly machines here. And this one winds up being, and he wound up actually finally going and actually implementing a clock that will always output basically 16 items every single time. So double swinging the items in the assembly machine. So that was kind of like a nice change just to see that, because that was an improvement over the last one. So in theory, this one would be better from the double swings that are coming out of the engine units, and this was a lot harder to figure out. So that's so just kudos for taking the time to actually go and get the clocking right in general. So that goes and creates basically a 240 version using one clock for all these, which in theory should be better using one clock, so less basically decider combinators in general, because decider combinators has a cost, right? So this should be better because it's basically sharing them, and we're going across here. So that was then the main design choice the design change that came into play. And then what I wound up doing is I said, okay, this is really similar to the very first design that I created, but the main difference between these two, and I'll first cover this. I have some instability because I don't think my clock is exactly perfect, and because it's not fully based on the speed. So there's one difference because of the reverse engineering and not knowing exactly how Theon was doing it. I approached this slightly different. I looked at the exact rate that the lead winds up creating it, and I based my clock on that. So I think the instability comes from because I technically need a subtick clock to get this fractionally correct, because the crafting speed of this machine is 66.0312, so it's going to be a non-whole number in terms of crafting. 240 or 120 per second is a nice whole number, right? So that's why I have to compensate by adding this little circuit here that says, hey, wait until the advanced circuits are fully saturated, and then once they are, you can start it. So for that reason, the clock isn't the same strategy, it's just now overclocked. It goes faster because it exactly monitors the speed of the input machine, and this keeps on working almost constantly. So you can see like this machine runs significantly longer than this machine, which will start and stop more often because it's short cycling it to underclock it. So this would be a full clock, this is an underclock design. So it is a slight difference in terms of how it's actually clocked. And that's just the result of me not knowing how the original method was done. So I don't know, maybe it's better. But the main difference that kind of comes into play on these designs is that then occasionally basically the end of the line will have wake lists, because they will very occasionally like basically fully back up like you're seeing up here. So but they can skip a couple cycles. Oh, and because the quote belt on its side isn't moving, then technically the transport line doesn't maybe have to scan, and so it can fully shut down. I don't know that that's really true or not. But anyway, the downside is you get more of these like starts and stops cycles that exist because of it being overclocked. But we'll see in the results. Maybe it's better. I don't know. Anyway, this is the fun part of not always knowing exactly how something works and trying to figure out yourself. You might come up with a new concept. Anyway, so where I was getting at, this was the very first design that I talked about in the very beginning. This is the second design. The main difference is that I wound up just creating in the very first design a clock that controls all the inserters interacting with the assembly machine. And then I created just a very simple lead follower that would activate occasionally for these assembly machines and the engine units themselves. I wound up saying, okay, I could take this out and use just specifically just the one clock to control everything. So that took me a little bit more time to figure out the exact ticks when they had to do that. The way I did is I just observed based on taking off the circuits to it, letting them run with just by themselves, all just naturally by using wakeless to target the actual machine and just run like the way that the game would normally control them, so unclocked. And then I just picked the timings from there. So I just basically chose those windows and kept them exact. So that's where I wanted to see, okay, can this clock overall, now that I have this all perfectly clocked in that same way, can I compare that? So what we get then from this is we have a couple different hybrids here. We have recipe switching, we have picking up directly from a belt, we have engine DI with this being fed down here. We have a red circuit design that I had created, one that has, using the methods from CivCal. And then we have a hybrid here of Baon's original clocking, so fully clocked build, using my recipe switching tech, and having the engine units, basically everything belt fed down here. And so through these combinations, what I'm hoping we can do is we can compare all these and now run a benchmark. And the way we're doing this is I'm going to take all the designs that we had talked about previously here. And I'm going out of alt mode because I don't want to show the names of the designs quite yet. But the overall rankings of like, okay, how do the hybrid designs fit in with all of the other designs that made it to the finals in the last round? And so, drumroll please, let's get into the results. So in the previous round, this was the ranking of all the designs that you're going to have here. So I want to play particular note to 4 of the top 4 designs. The percent differences between them is extremely minor. So we're talking about that they are very, very close to each other. So just keep that in mind. So the first place in the last round of the competition, the playoffs, was the design 18 by Lady Mayneth. That was a direct insertion design that goes and puts in coal directly into the plastic cryogenic plants. Then there's my design, Flap's design, and then the second version from the very original version from Lady Mayneth that happened to have more beacons in it. So these are the first 4, and I just want to pay special attention to these because of how close they are in terms of their performance characteristics. And so in this round, they were run for 36,000 ticks. In the new round, they're run for 27,000. So in the new, and basically in the finals here, what we wound up seeing is, we ran them for 72,000 ticks and for 6 runs. What is fascinating when you look at the whole update time distribution, the overall, you can see that the groupings were a lot tighter, which was nice compared to the first time. So just running them for longer seemed to be just better in general. You still had some slight outliers, but overall it just wound up just being pretty decent. So I include the baseline just so that we again know where we started and where we're at. But what I'm really excited about is that there's these 3 hybrids that wound up having a noticeable performance increase. And we'll talk about those in a second. But those first 4 that I talked about here, you wind up noticing that the overall distribution of their scores, you wind up seeing that actually Lady Mayneth's design number 8 swap places with Lady Mayneth's design number 18. The reasons for that, don't have a really great answer for that. We know that having more beacons is potentially worse, but the kind of where it comes down to is like how much worse, right? So again, when we're talking about fractional improvements, like in the long run, they can be rounding errors in terms of like what the performance differences are going to be. And that's kind of nice to see that here is that because of how close these designs were in their original percent differences, like you can see that, okay, over the course of a longer run or from benchmark to benchmark or timelines of when you run them, they wind up being really close in performance. Now, that's kind of where, for me, just to say, like, if a design is within 1% of another design, they're basically equivalent in my mind because of exactly what you're seeing. This will happen. You won't always have exactly consistent results from one benchmark to another when they're that close. Now, what we can see then too is like overall, the rest of them wound up being the same. We wound up seeing that what is interesting is I want to call out like specifically the placement of the hybrids. So you can see hybrid design number 4, design number 3 that were created here. And then you see that they are actually much lower in the rankings compared to these top 3 hybrids that are here. And so you're seeing also like that the entity update time is not that much different between, like, again, just looking at, we'll look at actual raw scores here. If you look at the entity update time, it is lower than some of these other designs that are here. Now, where it really makes or basically where this kind of starts to shine, is there is a electric heat fluid circuit update that kind of, it seems to be a little bit better, but the transport line time is also better, so it seems like there's like an overall effective like increase from these. But mainly what I'm interested in is, like, let's first explore why are these 3 hybrids ranked higher than these 2 specifically, because when you really look at it, hybrid 3 and 4 were based on my design 14. So in comparison, they are very close to each other. So let's break that out. I have a nice chart that I have that I will eventually include in the actual report, which will come sometime later this week. But the main thing that I will show, let's see, I have a nice chart that shows that. Okay, great. Here. So when you look at these 3 designs, what you're going to notice is that the entity update time is slightly higher. And there's a slight difference between design 4 and 3, which was mainly just a layout change. So let's just go for a comparison. Let's go and look at those 3 designs over here in Factorio. So if we go to those designs, what are those? So design number 14 is the design that was made by me, which is over here, right? So the difference in the hybrids that exist, which are now significantly further down the rankings that you can see, well, not significantly, but they're further down, is that, okay, the improvement that was made is it's using now the new clocking method that Thalen had created. The downside that exists was that now these particular inserters that are pulling out, they're getting pulled out always at a stack size of 8. So it seems like, so that basically means they have double the activation times, double the times that they're scanning on the belt, and double that they're bringing out. Now, my design is much more complicated, where I have a 4-phased approach to the actual build phase, right? So there's 4 different stages, all to perfectly get the assembly machines into a state where they can use lead follower naturally. But so it seems like the trade-off here of having to compromise and basically have this double inserting, always grabbing basically only 8 and then picking up, dropping, picking up, and dropping, that actually made the design overall worse. Because really, apples to apples, these 2 designs, other than the layout difference that exists here, is exactly the same as my original design, but they wound up having a performance difference, as can be seen by the graph here, right? So, and it is like a 3% decrease. So, and the only thing that's really different, if you see that, is like, okay, the clocking strategy is now double swinging, which is good, but now the portion where they're having to scan potentially the belt in front of them, the engine is the main difference. And that's the only thing I can account for of why this particular design wound up performing worse, because even just looking at like wake lists and things like that, we come over here and look at that, and we look at the wake lists for me, you can see them here, that there's no wake lists. And then even for these designs, you'll occasionally have this extra scan that happens of the belt, right? Every time it picks up, it has that extra scan. So that leads me to conclude that, yeah, that seems to be the issue of grabbing 8, is that you'll have these extra conditions, especially when it gets to the point where it's output blocked, because there isn't a clock here, so the speed of the machine is over the rate, right? And we talked about that before, where clocks are based on exact output. That means this is out of phase, so during the phase where this gets output blocked and it can't run anymore, and the rest of these are still going to have those extra scans of the belt and the scan that's in here, and they have these extra flickers that happen. So it seems like that was very expensive, and so that was a downside to having to kind of basically pick them up always on the 8 tick. And that's kind of the same general trend that we saw with all the designs that didn't make it into the finals, was that their control strategies were grabbing it in that basically every 8 instead of every 16. So that seems to be the commonality of the differences there. So moving on from that, what is interesting then, if we continue to go on with the results from there, we wind up seeing that, okay, so Flaps design out of the original submissions was the #1 design, and it ultimately wound up beating Lady Manus by a 0.48% difference, or a 0.96% increase overall for Flaps design, so being performance-wise being better. So what's interesting though is how the first hybrid that I created wound up being a 5% improvement. So let's talk about these top 3 designs and compare those, because like this is where we're seeing the obvious improvement in terms of them. So going back to Factorio, if we go up now to, and these are all ranked in order, if you look at this first design that I created, the main difference that I made was I removed a couple different things, ultimately. One, I switched to direct insertion for using assembly machines. The other thing that I did is I chose to have a different type of clock, but a clock that basically allows everything to double swing. And ultimately then too, some of the differences that I made to the red circuit build is I kept the functional layout exactly the same. The only difference is now I am double swinging on all the inputs. And you'll see that here, as this is always double swinging. So using that seems to have made also an overall net improvement. And then from there, going into the final like design, is one of the decisions that I specifically wanted to make was to make this always tileable. So always being able to share beacons. So if a build like in the last rounds could share beacons and would work with it, I use that. So that also is an improvement, because now this particular design worked under the concept of using as much beacon sharing as possible. So there is no beacon except for on the ends that isn't at least touching one other building. So there's always 2 buildings at least that they are using. So that's like efficiency-wise is really good for the beacons, the impacting at least 1 or 2 extra buildings. So there isn't a beacon that's on this design that isn't impacting more than 1 building. So that was kind of a nice change that was made just to make this overall improvement there. Count-wise, entities are actually, there's more inserters here because of the overall direct insertion design here. But kind of going towards, like, if you compare, you know, that first drop-off of this hybrid design versus Flaps design down here, the main difference is that, okay, we are belting both ingredients now, right? So if you look at that, what's interesting is that there's still, you had to belt at least 1 ingredient even to do like a double DI. So what that kind of leads me to believe is that there's a kind of a nice realization out of this competition, is that the inserters that are pulling from a belt, if it's not moving, that cost is lower. But it seems like by allowing this to double swing, this actually wound up outperforming the direct insertion compromises that you had to make here. So even though this particular 1 scan is cheaper, you know, pulling from the steel off the belt here, the consumption rate of the best bang for buck that you're going to get is the actual pipes, because the consumption rate of pipes is twice that of steel. So you're really only basically if you're, you know, these are swinging for a stack size of 16, you're going to save basically 1 lookup every, however many that would be, 3, 6, 12, so every like 5 swings or so. So every 4 to 5 swings, you're basically going to save 1 extra check that is being done from a belt, which seems to not be really worth it. So, and because of the amount of compromise you have to make on the number of beacons here, because you look at the ratio here, right, this is a positive of 1, and then ultimately this is active longer, compared to over here, this has, instead of 3 beacons, it has 6, so it winds up then being at a point where it is overclocked by 4. So basically 4 extras. That means that it only has to run, because the consumption rate is 5, it's running every other cycle basically is when it happens to be crafting, which is kind of nice. So with that kind of how it's showing this here is that there seems to be a point where picking up very low flow items off a belt can be actually really good. And that's kind of further shown with the design that's even made here by the hybrid from Thalen and myself, is that, all these like inputs that are here are all being double swung as much as possible. And they're able to pull up the items that are low consumption rates, right? So like basically only at 5 every second. So, every 3 swings, basically like every 3 cycles you have to swing. This is, every 6 cycles or so you have to swing, etc. So this is every other cycle you got to swing for this. So like consumption rate is a lot lower on these designs. And you can see that like, okay, let's go again and look at the difference in comparison. So you start to see that the drop-off now coming from the first design, where it implemented this clocking strategy over the design from Flap, wound up being a 5% basically overall net decrease for Flap, or a 10% improvement for my design in terms of overall whole update time. And then when you go to the next round here for Thalen and versus my design, you can see this is now into the 1% kind of net difference. So the diminishing returns especially show up because the hybrid, the last one that I wound up creating, was a 0.42% decrease in the second position compared to the first. So really diminishing returns. So very, very, very similar. Now, the designs are different when we go back and look at that. So the designs themselves, they wind up being a different strategy overall. So you can see here, this is engine DI. This is recipe switching. But I find it really fascinating that like the recipe switching technology is actually like pretty decent in this particular case. Now, the reason this performs so much better than the other 2 hybrids that exist is because now this is always double swinging and can grab, 32 items in those times. So it seems like the main difference here, and yes, they are sharing 1 clock for all these inserters. Now, I'll touch on that in a second because I ran a separate benchmark on really the benefits that you get from that. But where I'm coming from is like, okay, the inserters dropping here specifically, they wind up now double swinging. So if you look at wake lists, there's none. They're not scanning more than they actually necessarily need to. They are dropping exactly in time, perfectly. They have no extra scans, and it's saving all those things that we didn't see on designs, the hybrids of 3 and 4. So removing that compromise and getting a perfect clock, and also this took a lot of time to figure out, so thank you, Thalen, for doing this. You can see that like that made that much of a difference to basically change this layout. Now, it also is using this other red circuit build, so that can be accounted for as well a little bit. But overall, like the main thing that I'm really seeing here is this net difference of a change. So now, when I went to, now if you're looking at basically the first hybrid compared to the 6, I touched already on exactly how I made the changes. But it seems like just going that little bit of an extra mile to get these to be perfectly synced up and having an explicit clock without having to read an extra basically amount from the machine itself wound up making that overall net difference that wound up getting it to be to get that 1% extra in performance. So overall, that's kind of the result and what we're seeing at the moment. Now, I did mention that I tried out what would happen if you wind up having 1 clock for multiple of these, because what I basically said was, hey, technically, I can take this same design, and I should be able to go and create a 1 clock version of this. So I'll load this up so that we can talk about it. And while we're doing that and waiting for that to load, I will go and I will show what I'm talking about for that. So there is a single run that I did for specifically just those design comparisons. So I took the best performing quote unquote design in my mind, again, these 2 designs, the one for the hybrid from Thalen and I, and then the design that I created are the same because they're under 1%. Really, like all these designs, these top 3 designs are all equivalent because of how quickly they could change, right? So then looking again here at the I had this. Okay, so I created a test where I created the original design that I had, and I compared the performance difference of adding 1 clock for everything. So you can see that there is a % difference, but look at the difference in percentage here. This is 0.11%, so really, really small. So I'll showcase what that is over here. So here's the original actual design that I created for benchmarking purposes. So this is the same design as that you're seeing for design number 6, the hybrid. But the main difference here is that all of these inserted are all sharing a clock. So this one control clock here is just daisy chained with these constant combinators across all the designs that are here. So every single thing is activated exactly at the same time. All the transport lines, everything is exactly synchronized. So you gain a very small percentage, 0.11% performance decrease of having extra combinators and an extra clock, it seems like. So that's where I've had this argument many times of like, okay, you just use one clock to control everything. Yes, it matters, but it seems like in this particular case, at least in the benchmark that I created, the performance difference of running one versus the other made almost no difference at all. So you can do it, and it does improve things if you want that extra tiny little bit of performance improvement of removing this for 8 copies. Now, potentially, if you had it for all 96 copies, you'd see even more of a performance improvement, but realistically, how many of these are you actually going to fit on the bus? Probably not many more than this, because they're already getting close to like the pipeline extents on these, so there's kind of like a diminishing return unless you have a global clock being sent by radars, but then there's cost of radars. But anyway, you kind of get where I'm going with this, is that particular performance improvement didn't seem really to be worth it. It seems like, looking at the overall performance characteristics, it seems like double swinging seems to make a very large improvement, and the layout matters, sharing beacons matters, and I'm just excited about this, because if you look at like where we started with the baseline, right? We were at 13. You look at the overall results. Let's go back up to here to just the raw numbers. You can see that, like, on average, we were taking 1.67 milliseconds of average update time on the baseline. And then going now down in terms of improvements, if you're looking at this was 1.102 milliseconds of update time. So what does that mean, like, in general? So I took just the whole update time. That's what basically I'm using here as the point of comparison for these percent metrics. So the whole update time on average across these went from 1.67 microseconds down to 1.1 microseconds, right? So in general, what that means is that the percent improvement that's here is this went from being about 50% worse than this design that was here. So that's a large improvement on the scale of things, right? So that means that you can have an extra, basically one extra design for every 2 that you have, is basically the ratio, if I'm looking at this right? So that's a pretty substantial improvement from where we started, from all the different improvements that we made. So that's pretty exciting. So as always, all these different designs will be on my benchmark, the public blueprint markdown file that I have on my GitHub page, which will also always be included in the video description below. So go and check that out if you want to see these designs. Also, if you want to see any of the all the designs that have been submitted in this video, you can definitely go and see all of those by also just looking at the results section, and that will have every single blueprint included, and all of those blueprints, when you go to them, just so that you know, if you will have a site that's like this, and you will see every single one of the designs along with a blueprint snapshot that you can just go and click on, and then they'll have you the raw string, and you can go and check it out yourself. So that concludes at least the results section of the initial, basically where we're at. So with that, I want to go in the next section here a little bit about like some takeaways, and I will see you then at the conclusion. So if you're a veteran of Factorio, you'll know that the difficulty spike when you go from red science up to green science and then is relatively small. And the moment that you jump to blue, that's where a lot of people who play Factorio will traditionally quit the game because of how much more complex it is. Well, it turns out it is the same thing for when we get into mega basing. If you look at the number of designs that are submitted here and the different ways and the ways that they went about it, and in some ways much more complex designs, much more simple designs, a lot of clocking versus not clocking, you can see just the vast amount of differences in the way that somebody would approach this really complicated problem. So the thing that I learned from this is that it's really helpful once you get into these large black box kind of designs, or blades as we're calling them. The benefit that comes from that is sometimes that it's easy to test the whole entire design from the beginning to the end. The downside is you kind of lose some of the nuances. So that's where kind of breaking down and doing just red circuits by themselves was really helpful in terms of us testing these. So going forward for all the other sciences, as we go next into purple science, as we voted on in Discord, the Next science is going to be even more complex. So we're going to have where we're going to have now, 4 inserters that have to interact with the machine compared to 3. So there's going to be even more complexities in terms of timing and control logic and all those things. So the next thing that I want to talk about that I found kind of interesting with this is just how much your overall control strategy that you do matters. So you can see that all the designs that didn't make it into the finals all did one, at least there was a very common pattern that existed between them. And it was to output items instead of every 16 that it has to drop, it would grab it at 8 items. So the benefit that was then, so that you can see is that, okay, then the inserters have less activation signals from the control network. And on top of that, they have less scans that they're invoking as a result of that from the belt itself. So going up to 16, going to the full stack size matters a lot. So getting to that point mattered. This was then, and that's also shown here because of the 2 hybrids that didn't make it to that underperformed compared to their other hybrid counterparts, is because of them dropping basically at twice the rate that it has to scan from these. And you can see that even in the activation signals that are coming across here, right? You can see that every other time it has to scan both of them for a small blip because it's grabbing only 8 items. So that extra cost of scanning the belt, scanning the actual assembly machine, that adds an inherent cost. And especially as it backs up, then it gets out of sync and has an even higher cost because it's constantly having to scan for every single cycle, waiting for this inserter to drop. So that's where your control strategy matters a lot, because you can see just how much further down in terms of the placement it was, even though it had an objectively better clocking method for the head module here. So that's another thing that I'm seeing is like your control logic matters a lot. Guarding how many signals you're sending, how many times they're doing a scan from a belt matters the most, and getting that into it, just reducing the amount of times that's to scan the transport line in front of it, and also picking up the items that it has to pick up matters a lot more for belts. Not as much for direct insertion, because the cost is very low in terms of what it is having to scan versus the actual moving belt. That's another thing that I've kind of learned from that. I'm also seeing a general pattern from red and green science, and then going now into blue, is that there's a high temptation to go into creating, things that have 60 items per second that are transporting across the belt, and then you going and producing 120 items on the output, because that's exactly capping out the speed of the belt. In a lot of cases, the downside of those kinds of designs is that you would immediately go and say, oh, okay, well, because of the productivity, let's just go immediately to 480 per second. The downside there is that now you're interacting a lot of times with a moving belt. The only design that kind of changed from that pattern was when we were in green science, that it really mattered the exact spacing of all the inserters to get it exactly so they were always picking up from a non-moving belt. So in a lot of cases, as you look at these designs, by producing constantly and always having the belt itself not interacting with a moving belt, it was just better to make in a lot of cases 240. The exception was this design here, but when you really think about it, what are they transporting across their lines? Well, they're all broken up into a section that is well under the 120 per second per lane. So that's where in my mind, just kind of looking at these different designs that when we're talking about them, going and designing something around the absolute max of the belt capacity is not a good thing for picking them up. It's better to just have a lower, basically, transport line update, not transport line update time, but having less items moving over them so that you're always interacting with a fully stopped belt is good. The next thing that I want to get into is when we talked about the iteration from, going from picking up every other time, so if picking up 8 items and then dropping on the second swing, and then going into designs that did 16, that was better, but it seems like double swinging and doing a double output swing seems to be a further evolution in terms of the clocking strategies that exist for stack inserters. They specifically work well for stack inserters because of the fact of how fast they move and can dump items onto a belt. This wasn't the case with bulk inserters in the past, so this actually turns the concept of stack inserters picking up 16 items into being a kind of a problem to deal with, and it turns it on its head and says this is actually a feature. And what it does is it allows it, like you just saw there, to pick up 12 items at a time, and at the last swing. So it picks up 16, then 16, and then we'll get stuck at 12. Why that is beneficial is that it gets you around some of the problems that we've had that plagued so many of these builds in this particular for this particular science, which was desyncs. So when we talk about this, the main fundamental difference that the clocking strategy allows you to do over lead follower is it allows you to now not specify and oscillate around the lead's speed, but it allows you to basically set a fixed output rate that you want. And stack inserters kind of allow you to do that. So what it does by double swinging is it gets you around the desync that happens, but then 2, it allows the machine to have the occasional stopping position where it will have a run out of ingredients. And that can be explicitly done with the clock so that your output, as you just saw here with this transport line here, it exactly filled in the gap that was needed to make exactly 120 per second. That's a really nice feature of using clocks because you control things on a tick-by-tick basis. It also means that the ratio, if you look at the crafting speed of this machine at 68.9062, it's a rounding error. In order to actually control the clock to perfectly match this, you'd have to see, basically, if you watched my lab series where I talked about sub-tick clocking, that's when you'd actually have to use that because now the actual speed of the machine is not a whole number. However, your output is a whole number. So by choosing your clock to match exactly the output rate that you want, that can be a benefit so that you never have an inserter that is going to interact with a belt that is completely fully stopped, right, when it's outputting. So the thing that I would say to that in contrast is that my kind of other way of approaching this without knowing how this really worked is I still based it on the machine speed itself. And I didn't do it with a sub-tick clock, which would have been the correct way to approach it. I still approached it where you can see that there is an overflow of items that are created. However, I think the reason why this still worked well is because the amount of overproduction is very, very low here. We're at 121 per second. So it takes a lot of cycles to get to the point where you're actually getting output blocked here. The cost associated with inserters interacting with a non-moving belt, as we talked about, is lower. And so if we go to the debug menu and we look at transport lines, you can see that there's actually 2 transport lines per side of the belt. You have one half and the other half, right? You can see that because of this white line, this transport line is completely stopped. So whenever this is dropping items onto the belt, sure, it activates for a second, but then can fully rest, just like this inserter can. Now there is a point where it will get output blocked, like it will here in a second, like that, where it has to drop. That costs a little bit more. Didn't seem to matter that much, but the other benefit that you get is while it's sitting here just constantly dropping, since the belt isn't moving, and I very explicitly chose this to be not the priority lane, which is the one on the bottom, but I use it as the top lane so that it itself is considered to be fully resting. But chose that explicitly to allow this machine and this assembly machine to occasionally stop fully and be out of cycle. So it seems like this isn't like an optimization that is inherently better because this method down here is exactly perfect where it exactly fills those 2 lines. So this seems to be actually a lot easier to clock if you're going to go about it compared to the confusing way that I did it in my own mind. So those are 2 different ways to do this clocking that is a little bit closer to the way lead follower does it versus the way that a output clock does it, right, for controlling these. Now, the other thing that I find really interesting from this that I learned as well is that using latches in general seems to be the common pattern of a good thing objectively for these designs. So this is a version here that Civcal came up with, which was a latched version of the clock that you saw on the right. This is the assembly machine is so much faster, so it has a much higher automatic insertion limit, so it's easier to do multiple swings for lead follower control. That was better than constantly topping it up every single time around 16. So that seems to be good too. So multiple swings all in one short succession, even if you have more inserters than you need, and swinging 6 times seems to be overall just like something that is better to do as well, is just having them happen in very short succession. At a whole high level, if you look at every single concept of this design, designs that have now made it to the absolute #1 positions are latching things like absolute crazy. They basically, we are latching the oil refineries and telling them when to start and when to stop. We're doing that then on the inserters. We're latching them starting and stopping. We are latching even the inserters that are dropping items from a belt. We're picking up things in double swings. We are purposefully controlling things so that they happen in a much more spiky manner. And I'm saying that very intentionally because I got comments in the last video saying, oh, well, spiky designs are bad. I mean, that's not the case clearly here. In every single round of this competition, even outside of chemical science, you've seen that spiky designs are winning consistently. Why is that? Well, it seems like at least the game engine here for Factorio benefits significantly when you wind up doing expensive things quickly at the same time. So back to back, having continuous production of those items. And I saw that also when I was designing the recipe switching concept that I came up with. Latching those, and you see that even in Geist design. Geist did a very similar concept for his build. I'm going to try to find it down here, which was, right, that is not actually in this particular design. So he also came up with the same concept and also was latching it. So that seems to be, in general, just when you're recipe switching, the expensive part for recipe switching specifically was the changing of the recipe. So by latching, when it's changing its recipe state and what it's crafting, seem to be better as well, because it allows it to then run for a longer period of time. You can see just how long this is resting because of just how fast the crafting speed is. Crafting speed on this machine is 276.5. We just saw an assembly machine that was at 60, right? So this is so incredibly fast. So by latching it and only going and producing items when they fall under a certain threshold, seem to be just a better thing and allowing the inserters to constantly swing back to back to back. So in general, across the board, latching seems to just be a superior thing for literally everything. So that's an interesting discovery for me as well, going through this series. The last thing that I want to touch on a little bit, because I didn't get to test it fully, was the concept of was engine direct insertion better? Clearly, looking at these two designs, no, it's not a clear thing that's better. I'm noticing is that if you have a low flow rate item that's going across a belt like this, it can make sense in some situations to just pick it up from a belt and paying a little bit extra cost to the inserter occasionally, and instead of sacrificing more beacons. And so that's really clear here for basically the engine science here, or the ratios here. Basically, because of productivity and the way that it scales, one swing of the chemical science output is going to be half swing of this. Or another way to think about it, every 2 times the swings an engine unit has to swing. And then even more because of productivity, every single time that the engine unit is going to be created, it only needs now 1 pipe compared to the 2 that would normally need in the base recipe. So it means it's a 1-to-1 ratio when these are swinging. So that means, and then it is a 1-to-2 ratio whenever the engine unit needs something from a belt. So really, in reality, when you are dropping an item from this assembly machine, every 4th time it does that, this inserter has to pick something up. So it's really low in terms of when it actually has to do anything. So yes, this costs more, but the downside that comes from this is if you look at the production rate of this particular engine unit crafting assembly machine, it can make 9.8 items per second. And that is it's very close to being 2 times the output rate of this particular of the consumption rate. So it can actually stop for a very long period of time. Turn off transport belts, because I think we've covered that in depth. So this gets to stop more. The downside, if you look at let's say this design, this iteration, and this is a really good comparison, is Flap's design and the first hybrid that was created, is this still has to, because of the nature of us having 3 ingredients, you still have to at some point pick something up off a belt, because you're not going to easily fit another foundry in here. And yes, you could physically fit it, but now you're going to drastically reduce the number of beacons around the actual engine unit and around the chemical science production. So the trade-off here is that now when you're looking at this, because of this extra direct insertion, yes, you're saving 1 out of every 4 swings in expensive lookup from a belt, but you still have that here, so you're not benefiting as much from it. And then additionally, the crafting speed of this engine unit is almost 1-to-1 with the actual chemical science. So it means that up here, this can rest every other cycle, which can be seen by when you press F5 and look at the resting period. It's like basically almost every other time that this actually creates a craft, this actually has to go and run. And so whereas this one's almost always constantly running. So because of that, I think in this series here, as we went into, not series, but for chemical science, it made sense to still pick up occasionally low flow rate items. It then even got better once you double swinged back to back from the actual belt itself. So in my mind, when you look at this, it seemed like the direct insertion didn't play as much of a part in this, because you can see that there's a direct insertion design, then recipe switching to belt design, and then ultimately going back to direct insertion. That seemed to not be the differentiator. What really mattered was the control logic around the inserters when they're interacting with the belt and how often they're actually doing that. So as we get into like the next science, getting into purple science, we're probably going to see that, okay, when we're picking up from a non-moving belt, for some of the more compressed recipes that don't need it as often, it's better to do that than a maximal direct insertion build. So those are some, and this is supposed to be a very short section on a high level overview of all those items, but as traditionally as I do things, I ramble for a long time. So hopefully this section isn't, you can actually stick with it and listen to all the different things that I had to say. But that's my overall analysis and the conclusion of what I'm seeing worked well and what will probably work well for other sciences kind of going forward. So very excited for that. So as we end the video off, I want to say thank you as always for your attention span and getting to this, if you got all the way to the end of the video here. I appreciate, first off, every single person that has participated in this competition. There were so many designs that got submitted that we iterated on, that we've created hybrids from, all kinds of concepts from going and bringing back silos, going and having trains to actually transport materials. We even had a burner build that was submitted to basically go and test out, just seeing what would happen if you use burners for everything. So the control strategies and the way, not just control strategy, but the whole entire design concept were so unique and kind of showcase that there are so many different ways to design these things, that no two designs are alike. So what I'd like to just thank all the people that are on my screen here where their name is listed, just for every single, all the time that they took in participating and helping to create a design. Going forward, I've realized that I can't handle the scale of creating all these designs manually, and it drastically increases the amount of time it takes for me to release a video, as I'm just one person. So going forward, the way that we're going to do this is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be creating a base template file that all the designers are going to be able to have access to. And then they will go and have to incorporate at least the very first version of their design, and then also submit a blueprint. Because of some of the automations that I created in this particular series, I now have the ability to not need a lot of the information that I previously had to ask from designers. So in the past, what I wound up having to ask for was something that always kind of showed up in the original README that I covered in the very first round of this session, was these design tags. Because now I can go and count every single entity that's in a design and also how many beacons are actually surrounding them, and I've fully automated that, I don't need those anymore. So now I can just go and create a very simple summary that gives me all the stats that I would ever want. So how many assembly machines there are, the average building per beacon, the actual beacon count, the beacons per assembly machine, and then you could even see, like, for example, when I was going over these, and this is how I created all the correlations that we saw in the last video, I was able to basically see, okay, so per, chemical science pack recipe, how many beacons are there? So there's 10, there's 11, there might be a multiple of that, there's 6. So I already have all the stats that I'd like to have, and I can even know all the recipes that are being used, whether using advanced oil processing or basic oil processing. I know all that. So that's already a distinction that I have just immediately from, because I don't need those. So that's already a way that we are automating this so that we can produce these results a little bit faster. The second way that we are automating this is I'm continuously improving my chart generation script so that I can have a little bit better charts, and then ultimately also for everyone else, whenever you're looking at, like for example, I didn't show them in this video, but there are some nice charts that where you can look at 18,000 ticks, and you can look at basically the overall like where the entity spikes were happening. You can see that in my design that was using recipe switching, you see a large spike there. The hybrid design from Theon and myself also has that same characteristic in that spike, while having a lot more distinct control times of what things are using. And so it's interesting that you can kind of flip through these. I want to always keep these as kind of a, from a legacy perspective to look at them. The other thing that kind of exists then again is I like to also have these kind of like shorter 240-second charts so that we can look at them all and kind of have an overall apples to apples comparison when we're looking at them. So I'm trying to continue to improve that to make it also more engaging and more interesting to you, and then so that I can kind of showcase that. So the last automation that's going to really, that I want to just give such a special shout out to, is whenever I wind up going and benchmarking things, I'm using a tool called Belt. One of the challenges that I have talked about in the past that exists for me is I have to go, whenever I create one of these designs, for example, and okay, I'll show mine builder's design. I didn't mean to click on that one, but as it's not the perfect example. But the main thing that I have to do is I have to go and set up the design itself. I have to go then and make sure that I'm creating a good copy of it. And then I have to normally check for a long period of time what the production output is of that particular design. And sometimes I have to sit here for a while, because if I'm going to be running, like in the last science I did for 10-minute tick interval, I have to go and check that it has this constant production output. So, and this is running at max speed for this design. So for this one, I have to almost real time kind of wait until this particular science goes and gets fully, just making sure that we have constant production and it's actually meeting the rate. I'll show a different example of one that, basically some of these final designs here, where I had to do this check normally manually for the longest time. So my process when creating these, and this is a little bit more just behind the scenes of what was going on to create basically all the results that you're seeing, is I would manually go and take the blueprint from a designer. I would go and hook it up to a common bus like this, remove power so that way, I'd have a startup circuit that existed here, that existed in my benchmarking tools, that would initialize the entire build by filling it originally just manually with all the items that I needed. I would then delete this after initialization like this, after adding power, and after cloning it. So there's the time that it takes to go and kind of create this copy, and then create all the copies that you're seeing up here and making sure those are all synced, and then finally checking the production output is consistent across this period of time. Even at going at 64x speed, this can go fast, but some designs aren't that fast in general. So this still takes a while to run this, and then I have to check in, make sure that this is good, and then finally go to the next design, and then I can move on to going and create the next blueprint. So by asking people to basically, when we get into purple science, to basically do the map creation myself, that's going to help me out substantially and make it so that I don't have as much kind of manual work, and then every person kind of takes just has to implement their design specifically for that particular basically just for the submission. That along with the blueprint, that's going to help out a lot. However, the big expensive part is I still need to validate this. Well, the reason I just mentioned Belt a second ago is because what Blousy is the original author of Belt, and he's been allowing me to beta test a new feature that he came out with, which I'm super excited about, which is called Belt, and then it is Validate, not Validate, but Sanitize. So what does this do? So what this does is a really, really cool thing. What it allows you to do is, and I actually experimented a little bit this with the finals here, is it allowed me to take these hybrids and run it through the Sanitize script. What it does is it gives you an output that is specifically immediately telling you, hey, how much of the Like, how many materials did you craft over the ticks that you specified? So it was really helpful in me finding the designs that were unstable at the 72,000 tick mark, which was what we did for this design series here. And I didn't have to do anything. I just had to let the script run. I could go do something else, come back, and after 10 minutes, I knew all the designs had passed basically the sanitization stage of producing the exact number of items that were required. That's major because that means that now the whole process of doing the initial validation that they can create the science and create it for the entire time period that we have is fully automated. So just, I can't say enough about how excited I am because of how much time that saves me specifically in creating these benchmarks and overall the results. It allows me to focus a lot more on the part that I think actually provides the value, which is going into testing correlations, looking for patterns, and finding and analyzing the actual designs, and a lot less time on the actual more manual side of creating everything. So I just want to say thank you for everyone that's in my community that's helping me with these things, because this really is a group effort. I know I'm the one who's talking about it, but all the people that are helping in the production, in like creating all these things and just helping out with it, especially with like the hybrids that we saw, all those things. That's just, it's a lot more than myself here. So just want to say just thank you to all those people that are either, you know, helping me to make these things better, and then ultimately for all the people who are watching, so that I can hopefully get things out a little bit faster, and we can still keep the scale, because I really love the fact that we can go, and just to touch base on this again, when we did the qualifiers in the very beginning, the fact that when we look at the results from the qualifiers, seeing a chart that had this many designs by so many different authors is just something so cool to see just in a snapshot like this. Just seeing so many different designs all tested and being able to be compared. It's something that you can't really do easily. So being able to automate this allows us to get the scale of having a lot of designs without the cost of the manual effort that would eventually slow us down as we got to more and more designs. So very excited for the future competitions. Like I said previously, Purple Science is the next one that we voted on. That's gonna be the next one that we're going to do. And so that's gonna be the agenda of the items that are gonna be there. So stay tuned, subscribe if you like that kind of stuff and you wanna see more of this. If you wanna help out the channel, just join the Discord, participate. That's a huge thing. The other thing that you can just do is, if you like this video, give it a like, and that's all I'm really gonna ever ask. So I appreciate, again, all the designers, all the people who are helping automate, and all the people like you who are watching this video and sticking around until the very end and listening to me talk about all the stuff that actually went into creating this particular mini arc of this series. So with that being said, the next items that you'll see is I will post later in the week a final like written version of this analysis so that we can have that for posterity and we can go back and refer back to it in the future. But other than that, that's all that I have for today. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.